Dear Lord Stone, dear Vice President of the Greek Parliament, Mr. Varemenos, dear Greek MPs, Mrs. Kassimati and Mr. Antoniadis, dear Greek Ambassador, Mr. Karamitsos Giras, dear President of the International Confederation of Pontian Hellenes, Professor Parcharidis, dear President of the Pampontian Federation of Greece, Mr. Topalidis, honorable speakers, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to have you all here today, especially under these circumstances. The fact that this room is full now shows that we are determined to resist terror, and we will not allow fear to invade our souls and corrupt it. Our ancestors were the victims of terror. They resisted and they survived, and so will civilization today. It is beyond any doubt that we should all unite and fight against terrorism. And one of the best ways to do that is by paying tribute to the victims of the genocide by the Ottomans and the New Turks, the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis, and all the other genocides that took place in the last century. These are also acts of terror, and we should take lessons from them in order to fight modern terrorism. We all thank Lord Stone from our bottom of our heart for taking the initiative to invite us here in order to join forces against all genocides and all acts of terrorism. I would like to thank the rest of the organizing committee, Ms. Anthi Theopoulou, Mrs. Eleni Mendesidou, Ms. Elena Athanasiadi, Ms. Peristera Peidou, Dr. Theodosios Kyriakidis, and Mr. Alexandros Efremidis for their hard work and commitment. Our event today will include lectures from prominent researchers, discussion after each lecture, videos, and the photograph exhibition on the back of the room. Our participating artists, Elisa Tamouridou and Daphna Talmor, are presenting their exhibition named Misplaced. Misplaced brings together two artists who use photography and collage to enact practices of remembering through creating forms of active forgetting. The resulting work consists of memory images and attempts to map out associations between history, time, and space. I would like to ask the speakers to stick to the time allocated, and I would like also to invite Emeritus Professor and President of the International Confederation, Mr. Parcharidis, to open the event.
Dear Lord Stone, dear Vice President of the Hellenic Parliament, Mr. Varemenos, dear members of the Hellenic Parliaments, Ms. Kassimati and Mr. Antoniadis, dear Hellenic Ambassador, Mr. Karamitsos Giras, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my sympathy to the families of the victims of the Manchester terrorist attack. The international recognition of the Greek Pontian genocide is one of the main aims of the International Confederation of Pontian Hellenes and the request of the Pontian Greeks worldwide. The event, the destruction of the ancient civilization, the genocide of the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, was organized under the same scope, the rise awareness of the past crimes and atrocities in order to prevent future crimes against humanity and to help establishing a culture of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect of all human beings. Thank you very much.
Our first speaker is Emeritus Professor Tessa Hoffman, who is I would like also to invite the Vice President of the Greek Parliament, Mr. Varemenos, to say some words. Thank you.
okay? Okay. I prefer to speak in Greek. Κυρίες και κύριοι, πριν και πάνω απ' όλα, θέλω να εκφράσω τα ειλικρινή μου συλληπιτήρια στην κυβέρνηση του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου, στο λαό της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας και πάνω απ' όλα στα θύματα της τραγωδίας που συνέβη στο Μάντσεστερ μετά από αυτή την παρανοϊκή επίθεση. Μεταφράζετε ή να μιλήσω λίγο.
Συγχωρείτε. Πρώτα απ' όλα, ο κύριος... First of all, First of all, the Vice President of the Greek Parliament would like to express his sympathy to the families of all the victims of the terrorist attack at Manchester.
Δυστυχώς, κυρίες και κύριοι, το θρησκευτικό και εθνικιστικό μίσος απειλεί να οδηγήσει την ανθρωπότητα πίσω σε προηγούμενους αιώνες.
Unfortunately, religious hatred
The nationalistic hatred.
Yes, and nationalistic hatred threatens to lead our societies
to drive backwards
to medieval
the humanity.
Yes, I'm not a translator, unfortunately.
Θύματα αυτού του μίσους υπήρξαν οι Έλληνες Πόντιοι.
Victims of these crimes were the Pontian Greeks,
που γνώρισαν τις σφαγές, τις διώξεις και τον ξεριζωμό.
who were the victims of many atrocities and crimes.
Εμείς δεν κηρύττουμε κανένα μίσος έναντι ουδινός, ούτε έναντι αυτού που διέπραξε τη γενοκτονία. We don't cultivate any hate, even against who has committed the genocide.
Against the perpetrators of the
Genocide. Λέμε απλώς ότι δεν μπορούμε να βάλουμε τις σκοτεινές σελίδες της ιστορίας κάτω από το χαλί.
We just want to say that we don't want to put the dark pages of history and swept it under the carpet.
Έχει σημασία να θυμόμαστε για να μην επαναληφθούν τα μαζικά εγκλήματα.
It is of great importance that we should remember so that these atrocities and these horrendous crimes will never be repeated.
Θέλουμε τη συνεννόηση με όλους και με την Τουρκία.
We would like to have cooperation with everyone, including Turkey, of course.
Αρκεί η Τουρκία να συμφιλιωθεί με το ίδιο της το ιστορικό παρελθόν. Όσο και δύσκολο να είναι αυτό, αν συνέβαινε, θα αποτελούσε την κάθαρση σε ένα ιστορικό δράμα.
The only precondition to this is that Turkey comes to terms with its past, and if that is...
Όσο και αν είναι δύσκολο αυτό.
And despite the difficulties of this, as far as it is very difficult,
Αν
of course,
συνέβαινε, θα αποτελούσε την κάθαρση ενός ιστορικού δράματος.
if indeed it ever takes place, it will be the catharsis of this trauma.
Δράμα.
Of this trauma, sorry.
Έχει σημασία,
It is of great importance,
όσο δύσκολο και αν είναι,
no matter how difficult it might be,
τα κράτη να αντιμετωπίζουν κριτικά τις επιλογές τους,
for the states
to face critical
to face
their
critically
responsibilities
their responsibilities, yeah.
και να αναγνωρίζουν τις ευθύνες τους
And to recognize their responsibilities
για γεγονότα τραγικά όπως είναι αυτά για τα οποία συζητούμε.
For such tragic events as the ones that we will about to embark into our discussion tonight.
Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω τους φίλους μας
I would like to thank our friends,
και ιδιαιτέρως τον Λόρδο Στόουν
And especially, of course, his lordship, Lord Stone,
που βοηθούν στον αγώνα των Ελλήνων ποντίων
that help immensely and contribute immensely to the fight of the Greek state in order to recognize the Pontian genocide.
Ένας αγώνας που είναι στην ουσία αγώνας της ιστορικής μνήμης απέναντι στη λύθη.
A struggle of historical memory against the idea that something like this will ever be forgotten.
Να είναι σίγουροι φίλοι μας
We would like to reassure our friends, they should be sure,
ότι δεν συμβάλλουν μόνο στην υπόθεση των Ελλήνων ποντίων,
that their efforts are not only they're not only important for the struggle that we have in order to recognize the Pontian genocide,
αλλά στον αγώνα, στην προσπάθεια της ίδιας της ανθρωπότητας να μην κατρακυλήσει ποτέ ξανά στο σκοτάδι του μίσους και της βαρβαρότητας.
But it's of paramount importance so that humanity will never go deep, will never roll back to this dark side, and we will never have these barbaric acts in the future.
Thank you for your attention.
I would like also to invite Mrs. Kassimati, the Member of Parliament of the Greek Parliament and member of the Greek party Syriza, to give us a short greeting.
Hello. I would like to thank you, my Lord, for extending this invitation, as well as the President, Mr. Parharidis, and the members of the International Confederation of Pontian Greeks, and the organizing committee, and the honorable guest speakers, and of course the committee who prepared, the organizing committee of this event. The honorable speakers for the study and the knowledge and background that will bring in this discussion and question regarding the genocide of the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, and of course the ongoing destruction of an ancient civilization even during nowadays. Speaking of destruction and life and loss, I would like first of all to extend to you our warmest condolences of Greek people and the Greek government for the terrorist atrocity that took place in Manchester on Monday and filled with grief the families and parents of the children and the whole of our country. This terrible event and the measures that were taken from last night brought us in this building instead of the House of Lords. But reading the history of this building and reading that here it was the preparation committee of the United Nations and the Security Council that first ever held their first deliberations, I believe that after all, it's a full of meaning venue to be and to discuss the just cause of the international recognition of the genocide of the Greeks of Pondus. This Holocaust brought about by Mustafa Kemal and the Kemalic state during the 1916-1923 period. Bearing in mind that people, a nation, does not simply disappear from history or by geopolitical doctrines or alienation and the effacement of its memory. Everyone has the right to demand the official and public recognition of the crimes inflicted up against them. It is not only a form of honor and a right in remembrance, but it is also a policy in order to avoid future such crimes. It is a matter of establishing and having rule of law and human rights, and it is a humanistic duty towards the perpetual and peaceful coexistence of people in the area of Eastern Mediterranean. I know as well that the first parliamentary question regarding the genocide of Pontian Greeks was tabled in November 11th, 1921 in the British Parliament. And I believe that it is a good starting point to launch an international campaign for the international recognition of the commemoration of the 19th of May Day as a World Day of remembrance of the victims of Kemalic Holocaust and genocide of the peoples in Minor Asia as Pontian Greeks. This is not a step to conflict, but it is a step, it is a policy for a future and prosperous future in the area of Eastern Mediterranean and in international affairs generally. Thank you very much.
I would like also to ask the member of the Greek Parliament, Yannis Ioannidis, and also General Secretary Yannis Antoniadis, and also General Secretary of the International Confederation of Pontian Hellenes.
Επίσημοι προσκεκλημένοι, σεβαστό Προεδρείο, κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας. Από καρδιάς σας ευχαριστούμε για τη θερμή φιλοξενία.
Honorable guests, members of House of Lords, I would like to thank you very much for your hospitality tonight, for having this ceremony here tonight, this speech.
Θέλω να εκφράσω κι εγώ με τη σειρά μου τη βαθιά θλίψη και οδύνη για τις αδικοχαμένες ψυχές όλων αυτών των νεαρών και βεβαίως τα θερμά συλληπιτήρια στους οικείους τους.
I would like to express again from my part my deep sorrow, disappointment and sadness for the tragic loss of the lives of the young people last night, and I would like to express my sympathy to them, to their families and their acquaintances and friends.
Εύχομαι να είναι αυτό το τελευταίο κρούσμα τυφλής βίας και να μην ξαναθρηνήσει ποτέ η ανθρωπότητα τέτοιους άδικους χαμούς.
I would like to wish that these tragic events will not be repeated in the future, that this one will actually be the last one, and we will not suffer this kind of atrocities ever again.
Γι' αυτό από αυτό το βήμα καλούμε τη διεθνή κοινότητα με τους θεσμούς και τα όργανα τα οποία διαθέτει να στέκει στο ύψος των περιστάσεων, να αναγνωρίζει όλα αυτά τα αποτρόπαια γεγονότα όπως είναι η γενοκτονία των Ελλήνων του Πόντου και με αυτόν τον τρόπο να αποτρέπει την επανάληψη αυτών των εγκλημάτων.
And because of this, we would like to express we would like actually to say to the international community to use its institutions and vast resources in order to condemn this kind of atrocities and this kind of sad events. And one of these dark pages in history is actually the genocide of the Pontian Greeks, and this is what we want from the international community, to take a step and to recognize it.
Και γιατί βεβαίως πρωτίστως οι ψυχές όλων αυτών των αδικοχαμένων αδελφών μας ζητούν δικαίωση.
And one of the reasons, of course, is that the souls of our long-lost brethren, the victims of the genocide, require and demand justice.
Ζητούμε επίσης από τη διεθνή κοινότητα να καταδικάσει αυτή την πράξη της Τουρκίας, η οποία αρνείται ακόμα και σήμερα να αναγνωρίσει τα εγκλήματα που έκανε και ασελγεί στη μνήμη όλων των θυμάτων των γενοκτονιών που έχει διαπράξει η ίδια η Τουρκία.
And it's of paramount importance to stress that Turkey, even now, even today, refuses to recognize the mass genocide of the Pontian Greeks and other, of course, communities. And we would like to say to Turkey that they have to change and they have to recognize and embrace their past and to address their crimes because the victims demand justice.
Καλούμε την ελληνική πολιτεία να μπει μπροστάρης μαζί με όλες τις οργανώσεις, ποντιακές και μη, ανθρωπιστικές και μη, να ευαισθητοποιήσουμε την διεθνή κοινότητα ώστε να λάβει μέριμνα για να μην γίνουμε μάρτυρες ξανά τέτοιων αποτρόπων γεγονότων, γενοκτονιών ή κρουσμάτων τυφλής βίας.
And it's of great importance that the Greek state is actually the great pillar into this effort in order to make sure that the international institutions take a stance and make sure that such tragic events will not be repeated in the future, events as like the ones that we saw even last night, not only the genocide events.
τιμή και δόξα στα θύματα της γενοκτονίας και καλή επιτυχία στην εκδήλωση. Ευχαριστώ.
Honor and glory to all the victims of the genocide, and best of luck to this great event tonight. Thank you.
I would like also to invite the Greek ambassador, Mr. Karamitsos Giras, to, if you would like.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all. I'm proud and honored to be here representing the Greek government on this event. As you know, the Greek government has taken significant steps to support the just cause of the Pontian Greeks. It has taken steps by supporting all the activities in recognition of this event around the world, and has taken also, of course, important steps towards the recognition of this event in Greece. We see the matter as a matter of justice, law, and rule of law in today's world where these values still matter. With only these words, I greet this event and I thank you for addressing the invitation to us. Thank you.
And moving on, our first speaker is Emeritus Professor Tessa Hoffman, who is a researcher of comparative genocide studies with focus on the Ottoman genocide against the indigenous Christians of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia. Among others, is a co-editor of the first collective monograph in English on the above-mentioned topics, and her lecture today is called Genocide in Three Phases, the Case of the Greek Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire between 1922 and 1912 and 1922.
Ladies and Lords, Excellency, dear friends, distinguished colleagues. Let me please start with a question. What is genocide? Scholars of genocide and history deliver diverse answers, but genocide, first of all, is a crime. Therefore, we have to consider the one and only internationally binding legal definition as given by Raphael Lemkin, who became the initiator of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. For Lemkin, the decisive element of genocide is not physical destruction or massive killings, but rather, quotation, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves, end quote. Lemkin's definition bases largely on the examples of genocide committed during the world wars of the 20th century, the Ottoman genocide against indigenous Christians during the last decade of Ottoman rule, and the Nazi destruction of European Jewry during the Second World War. The motives behind the Ottoman genocide are complex. The two major factors that drove the Muslim elites into genocidal radicalization were demographic changes after massive immigration and territorial losses. As the table of the Turkish demographer Kemal Karpat reveals, the share of Muslims in the Ottoman Empire was about a third of the overall population in the early 19th century. After the immigration of up to 7 million Muslim refugees during the following decades, at the turn of the 19th century, the proportion of Muslims was nearly equal to that of non-Muslims. Such balanced situation seems to have prompted the Muslim elites to seek for a durable dominance. after the Chauvinist Committee for Union and Progress, or Ittihadists, which European contemporaries dubbed Young Turks, had in 1908 overthrown the reactionary Sultan Abdülhamid II by a military coup d'etat, these new rulers developed the idea to stabilize the collapsing empire by homogenization, or, as it was paraphrased at the time, by Islamization. This catchword related also to commerce and entrepreneurship, which were predominantly exerted by non-Muslims, while Muslims were traditionally prohibited from interest rate business. Ittihadist or CUP leaders, however, expanded Muslim predominance to the Ottoman economy. The first and main victims of the boycotts and economic repressions that were intended to drive non-Muslim traders and industrialists into bankruptcy, suicide, or exile were the Greek Orthodox Christians, or Rumlar, Romans, as the heirs of the Byzantine Empire are called in Ottoman and in contemporary Turkish. With an estimated overall population of up to 2,700,000, this was the largest denomination of indigenous Ottoman Christians. Subsequently, the Rumlar were also the first to experience deportation, death marches, and the dispersion among Muslim majority populaces. Deportations were first implemented during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13 in eastern Thrace, where the regime experimented with two types of expulsions. While the cross-border expulsions of Rumlar into adjacent Greece resulted in the return of Ottoman Greeks after the war, deportations into central Anatolia with death rates of near to 50% proved as a more effective mean of destruction and were subsequently largely applied in following years. Until summer 1914, about 350,000 Greeks were expelled or massacred en lieu in eastern Thrace alone. Of these, 190,000 were deported to central Anatolia, where 46,000 died from diseases or during forced labor. The Ottoman authorities confiscated the possessions of the expelled, of the deportees, and the slave laborers. The Balkan Wars definitely turned the attitude of Ottoman statesmen. Their perception of Christians, and in particular of Greek Orthodox Ottomans, was now determined by revenge and mistrust into the Christians' loyalty. Months before the Ottoman entry into the World War in May 1914, the Ittihadist government decided to cleanse the Aegean and Marmara littorals from their Greek inhabitants. Already in mid-July 1914, Said Halim, the Ottoman head of government, informed the German ambassador about the, quotation, total removal of the Greek population from the littoral of Asia Minor, end quote. At this stage, the Ottoman Greeks were considered to be internal enemies in dehumanizing speech called internal tumors. The second dragoman, or interpreter of the German embassy, Dr. Herbert Schwörbel, who in summer 1915 traveled twice in official mission to Western Anatolia, found Greek women, children, and old people under precarious conditions in concentration camps along the Soma-Pandarma railways. They were deportees from the Marmara coast entirely left to themselves without food and accommodation. Schwörbel concluded, with the exception of Iverly and Smyrna with its environs, the entire Greek civilization which flourished until recently at the west coast of Asia Minor is destroyed, end quote. The deportations of the Rumlars continued throughout the Great War, accompanied by massacres, mass rapes, compulsory labor, confiscation and plunder of properties. The focus was now on the Black Sea or Pontus area and adjacent regions. The total figure of Ottoman Greeks deported during the First World War from Thrace and Asia Minor into the Ottoman interior varies by the factor 3. While the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the US-based relief organizations estimated that about 500,000 Ottoman Greeks had been deported, the Hellenic Foreign Office gave an estimate of 1.5 million deportees. According to a cable message of early June 1918 from Athens to the Hellenic legation at Washington, half of these deportees perished, quotation, from torture and illness, end quote. Metropolitan Germanos estimated the Pontus Greek casualties even as high as 80 or 90%. The victorious Allies failed to keep their promises given during wartime. Neither were the politically responsible Ittihadist statesmen brought to justice, nor were the survivors compensated or restituted. On the contrary, the years 1919 to 1922 signify the final destruction of the Rumlar. Already in November 1919, the British Admiral of the Fleet and Allied High Commissioner at Constantinople, John de Robeck, admitted in a report, "The Christians are now bewildered and terrified. Every district has its bands of brigands now posing as patriots, and even in the vicinity of Constantinople, robbery under arms is of daily occurrence, the principal victims being naturally the unprotected Christian villagers." Behind all these elements of disorder stands Mustafa Kemal. The government cannot and will not move a finger to help the Christians, end quote. Already during the World War, the notorious Chatelaire, or Ottoman highwayman, had frequently been recruited into the death squadrons of the so-called Special Organization or Tashkilat Mahsusa that convoyed and massacred Christian deportees. The Ottoman Empire of the post-war period was a failing state. Its government at Constantinople was challenged by Mustafa Kemal, whose followers were often enough devotees of the erstwhile Ittihad regime. In their military fights against the Allied and in particular the Hellenic forces that were brought to Western Anatolia in May 1919 for the defense of the Christians there, the Kemalist nationalists relied on the professional robbers as had their Ittihadist predecessors. Without any administrative restriction, local or regional influential gang leaders terrorized the Christian population of the countryside and small towns with arson, plunder, massacres, rape, tortures, and kidnapping of defenseless victims. The defeat and withdrawal of the Hellenic forces in late summer of 1922 and the subsequent seizure of the entirely undefended port city of Smyrna on the 9th of September 1922 by Kemalist regular and irregular forces marked the end of the final and most destructive phase. Smyrna the little Paris of the Near East and previously seat of the Hellenic administration in Ionia, was a predominantly Christian city of approximately 300,000 residents, and at that time, refuge for many Christians from adjacent and even distant provinces. The Kemalists waited until the night of the 13th of September, until the wind blew from a favorable for them direction, before they set fire on the Armenian quarter, which soon spread over the adjacent Greek quarter. As planned by the arsonists, many Christians died in their burning houses, were killed by collapsing walls or drowned in the harbor when trying to escape to the Allied navy of 27 battleships. It added to the horrors that the Allies watched more or less indifferently how their Christian co-religionists were burned, slaughtered, raped, shot down by machine guns, or drowned when repulsed by the Allied crews. 3 days later, the Kemalist commander Nureddin ordered that all Greek and Armenian men of 18 until 45 years of age to be treated as prisoners of war, while the remaining Christian Smyrniotes and refugees had to leave the country with a notice of only 14 days. Men and women were then separated, the men, perhaps up to 300,000, being led away and shot in groups outside Smyrna or other Greek towns of Western Anatolia. The remainder was kept in a state of slavery and treated with genocidal intent. Let me summarize and conclude. Against the background of massive flight and migration of war and civic war, it is difficult to offer laudable figures. In recent research, the total of Greek Orthodox victims killed during the last decade of Ottoman rule is estimated to be at least 900,000, or even more than 1 million, considering the many casualties that occurred during the expulsion or the first months after the arrival in destitute Greece, where many of the Mikrasiates succumbed to hardships, diseases, and despair. I would like to end my conclusions, which are not complete, but considering the time is flying, I would like to end with a quotation from a friend and author from another victim group from Turkey. Erdaşahin comes from the group of the Alevite Zazas of the central Anatolian region, Dersim. And knowing that I would this evening speak to you, he wrote me the following. In my opinion, often it is not enough or too little remembered that genocide means not only physical destruction. We have also to take into consideration that people who once suffered genocide are still suffering today, that they, until this day, search for missing family members, that their culture has been destroyed and still is being destroyed, including the Turkification of toponyms. We have to recall that the survival of the descendants of genocide survivors in Turkey has become more difficult because there is daily hostile agitation taking place. Thank you for your attention.
Dear Lord Stone, Your Excellencies, honorable guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I would like to warmly thank the International Confederation of Pontian Hellenes for kindly inviting me to speak to this important event. The expulsion of Greeks from Turkey in 1922-23, after the genocide, paradoxically described as the Asia Minor catastrophe, is a watershed event in the recent history of the people affected, and provided a precedent to ethnic cleansing that occurred in Eastern Europe a few decades later. Although the Greek genocide is not a recent world event, it has not been the subject of major historical interest and therefore remains unrecognized. Anatolian and mainly Pontian Greeks were the innocent victims of a broader Ottoman genocidal project aimed at all Christian minorities. It is my hope that this event tonight may provide some elements necessary to support a wider recognition in the not-too-distant future. Genocide is an international crime, an offense against international morality. Its punishment is similar to crimes as slave trade, piracy, and other international crimes. Since the crime of genocide falls within the category of delicta juris gentium, and crimes against humanity as defined in the indictment and the judgment of the Nuremberg trials, state responsibility and individual penal liability for genocide are not subject to prescription or any statutes of limitation. Even if, by the time of the concept of genocide was not existed, the criminal acts against the Christian people were clearly considered crimes against humanity and civilization under international law. The same conclusions France, Great Britain, and Russia reported in their joint declaration on the 24th of May 1915, the Treaty of Sèvres, signed on 10th of August 1920, although obligated the Turkish government to recognize the crimes and implied punishment for the crimes of genocide, which fall in the broad term of crimes against humanity, including actions of extermination, evacuations, mass atrocities, massacres, ethnic cleansing. Unfortunately, it was never ratified and was finally rejected by the Turkish national movement, who fought against the previous terms and significant loss of territory. Although some judicial procedures took place and some of the perpetrators of the genocide were sentenced, the Treaty of Lausanne, 3 years later, substituted the previous one, and the responsible remained unpunished under the cover of a declaration of amnesty. Despite the fact that among the genocides, the Armenian one is widely known, with many reports and documentations, it has unintentionally been faded from the memories of those unaffected in a manner of memory erosion. The synergy between many states and international communities' indifference, silence, and the faithful campaign on the other side of Turkey's attitude to deny and to erase the black pages of offenses committed on Turkish territory against Turkish citizens, though of Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian race, had a result not only the Armenian, but also the less known, the Greek and the Assyrian, to remain without resolution and reparation of the damages to the victims and descendants. The United Nations, until 1985, were forbidden after protests and arm-twisting by Turkey against any mention of the genocide in its chambers. According to the analysis of Professor Desayas, UN expert, although the perpetrators of the Ottoman genocide are dead, and therefore they are beyond the reach of criminal justice, still there are legal and moral obligations of the Turkish state to respond, to recognize, and to apologize towards the entire international community, erga omnes tokri. On the 9th of December 1948, as you saw in the video, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in which parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war,
is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. The debate on the Ottoman genocide's recognition and punishment of Turkish state is based on the incorrect concept that even if the Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire were subjected to genocide, the Genocide Convention cannot apply it retroactively. However, the Turkish liability for genocide was reflected in Articles 230 and 144 of the Treaty of Sevres 1920. Moreover, the German liability for the Holocaust of the Jewish people was reflected in the London Agreement in 1945. Therefore, both cases predated the Convention. In general, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide does not create a new offense in international criminal law, but is declaratory of pre-existing international law. Although the norms already existed, the effective international machinery was unfortunately in its early stages. When the United Nations drafted the Convention on the non-applicability of statutory limitations to war crimes and crimes against humanity, clearly and deliberately pronounced its retroactive application. Since January 2016, the Convention has 55 state parties. Turkey is not a member party of this Convention. However, it's crystal clear from international law that there is no prescription on the persecution of the crime of genocide, regardless of when the genocide occurred, and the obligation of the responsible state to make restitution or pay compensation for properties in relation to a genocide does not lapse with time. The continuing character of the crime of genocide is demonstrated by the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage and memory. Undoubtedly, the homogenization practices of Turkish nation were responsible for the hemorrhaging of the Christian minorities in Istanbul and the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, despite the conditions of the Treaty of Lausanne protecting the minorities' rights. The fate of the Greek people on the islands of Imbros and Tenedos reflects the most vivid violations of the conditions of the Treaty of Lausanne. The installation of an open prison for criminals from continental Turkey acted catalytically to the mass flight of Greeks as they suffered from rapes, violence, and criminality. The final formal elimination of the Greeks in Anatolia was marked with the events of the 6-7 September 1955. The Septembriana had an undoubtedly genocidal character and satisfied the criteria of Article 2 of the 1942 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide because they intend to destroy, as you saw, in whole or in part, the Greek minority in Istanbul was demonstrably present. The survivors of the genocide of Greeks in Pόντου and Anatolia, the survivors of the catastrophe of Smyrna, the survivors of the pogrom in Istanbul had devoted considerable efforts, individually and collectively, for the recognition, reparation, and compensation for the enormous damage caused, and demanded the preservation of the existing Christian monuments and properties in Anatolia and the protection of the few Greek minorities in Turkey. Where is restitution in the case of Jewish victims of the Holocaust has been granted and continues to be granted, the Greek and Armenian communities are still waiting for the acceptance of civil responsibility by the Turkish authorities. The Commission on Human Rights and more recently, the Human Rights Council have adopted numerous resolutions on the obligation to grant reparation for victims of gross violations of human rights. It is a general principle of law that the criminal cannot keep the fruits of the crime. Turkey still denies and rejects the genocide label, while at the same time shows disrespect towards valuable antiquities. After 1923, and over the last years, the Turkish government is trying to cover the atrocities happened at the beginning of the 20th century and using tactics of genocide denial, such as questioning and minimizing the statistics. Despite the total number of 3.5 million of dead Christians, Turkey still supports that the massacres were random, committed by out-of-control forces, that they were the result of instability and turmoil in the region, and therefore don't meet the legal criteria for genocide. Turkey's attempt to demonstrate and rewrite history, killing the memory and erasing the traces of the Greek presence is evident everywhere, as Turkish authorities convert Christian churches and monasteries to mosques. The fate of thousands of churches in Turkey is becoming more and more inauspicious. Turkey's President Erdogan's recent remarks disputing publicly the Treaty of Lausanne raise again serious concerns about the future of the diplomatic relations in the Aegean Sea. By way of comparison, it would be interesting to imagine what the Allied powers would have done to Germany and Austria had they repudiated the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain, as Kemal Atatürk did with Sevres.
2 more minutes.
I'm going to, the last 2 minutes, to speak about the post-traumatic stress symptomatology among the first and second generation of the Greek genocide survivors. And from my medical point of view, so I would like maybe an extra 5 minutes if the audience is still awake. The post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms were visible clearly on the first generation of the genocide, 1914-1923. There is a strong relation, believe me, between the numbers of traumatic experiences and the number of subsequent stress responses. The violence, the war, and the fact of being witnesses of the murders of their own people made them not willing to speak or narrate what happened in that period. For genocide survivors, the year 1922, apart from the year of the forced exchange population, became a mental location of remembrance of the Greeks in Pόντου. It is about a virtual place which consisted of all those elements that made it paradigmatic: trauma, loss, and exit. The trauma as a transit from the violence, the death, and the fear. The trauma as a loss. A whole civilization was lost. The people, the families, and their beloved ones, their cities, their villages, their homes, and their properties, their own way of living, and transit into a new treaty, the refugee stigma, the entirety of the locals, the tough years of the families to find their footing, the coming generations who, although didn't themselves have the uprooting experience, the experienced trauma transformed into a cultural trauma that was not based on living the experience itself, but on its transmission and on its cultural reproduction between the descendants. The trauma, therefore, does not have an impact only on the Pontian refugees per se, but also on their descendants. It concerns the sense of the past and the history, and shapes the cultural awareness and conscience. The 1922, with the asymmetric Treaty of Lausanne and the forced exchange of populations, meant the definite abandonment of the idea of Hellenism in Anatolia and Minor Asia. Additionally, it's now under investigation of my team the possible link between genocide, epigenetics, and endometriosis in the third and fourth generation of the genocide descendants. Endometriosis is a condition in which endometrial cells migrate outside the womb, and it affects fertility and reproduction. It can be caused through epigenetic mechanisms. Those who endure traumatic experiences can pass epigenetic changes down to their offsprings. That means if you had a parent or a grandparent who lived through a genocide, saw someone murdered, or who suffered a different mental trauma, you carry traits for the emotional impact in your genes. There are differences in the concept of genocide between government policies, social perception, UN experts, scientists and doctors, and personal understanding of genocide. However, emphasis should be given to the continuous destructive nature of genocide denial in the survivors of genocide and their descendants. The post-trauma, believe me, invades and erodes the personalities, even of second and third generation, gradually being transmitted into cumulative trauma. Essentially, the devastating trauma of genocide, loss of culture, loss of land, and of beloved persons, loss of ability to reproduce your children, can become a sort of psychological baggage continuously being carried on. To briefly conclude, it is high time to acknowledge the historical facts and the magnitude of this catastrophe. There is no doubt about the historical fact of the expulsion and the extermination of the Pontian people. After all, official documents of those times and testimonies of eyewitnesses of various nationalities provide sufficient evidence for the reality of the genocide. The genocide of Pontian Greeks has taken place. It is a real historical event, as proven by thousands of official records of ministers of foreign affairs. It is instead due to its insufficient awareness and insufficient interest of the international community that this strategy has remained largely unknown by the public and even by historians. In the age of internet and social media, it is no longer possible to maintain the blackout against recognition of the Greek genocide. It is only a matter of time until all governments, including the government of Turkey, acknowledge that the Greek and Armenian genocide make part of the history of mankind, as indeed the Holocaust is part of our sad heritage as humans. It is through transparency, unbiased investigations, intellectual honesty, international law, and human rights that the memory of these unsung victims will be honored now and in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Ioannidou has added another dimension in the studies of genocides. I would be very interested to see all the studies related to the epigenetics of the ancestors of genocide crimes. And this is also makes a perfect bridge for Ms. Steiner's speech after the short video about the academic approach. As what happened in the past is not excuse for the actions in the future, I would like the next speakers to stick in the timetable. Okay, fine. So, Dr. Pamela Steiner is a senior fellow in the Harvard School of Public Health, where she directs the intercommunal trust building project. The project aims to contribute to an improvement in the relationship between communities, and it aims to better understand the collective traumatization of peoples long marred in unresolved conflicts and the psychology of healing and building productive relationships. Her speech today is about yesterday's collective traumatization and today's unresolved conflict. Dr. Stein. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pontian Greeks, for inviting me to speak. I'm especially pleased and honored to be here because I am a lifelong Anglophile and Philhellene. Now, my question is, can you hear me easily? Seriously. So this is good. And let me know, please, if that changes, because there's no point in being up here. And from here, I can't make it out. So the perspective I'll offer is that of the impact of collective trauma and traumatization on the Balkan peoples and on some of the peoples of the former Ottoman and Russian empires. I'm a practicing psychologist and a facilitator of conflict resolution work. I try to understand the psychology of mass murder and genocide. That's an effort that is sometimes, but should not be confused with excusing or absolving those responsible. My work aims at prevention, accountability, and development of sustainable, productive relationships between enemies and former enemies. My talk is in 3 parts. First, I'll briefly explain my terms. In part 2, I change gears. I'll offer an account of the collective traumatization that occurred during the First World War involving Pontic Greeks and Armenians and others of the Ottoman Empire. Now, you all have a handout of 2 pages from me with 3 maps on them, and you will need them when I change gears. At the historical moment I am discussing, the situation of the Pontic Greeks and Armenians were in good part similar. Then the story moves to Muslim Azerbaijanis, also known as Azeris, and to the Armenians of the Russian Empire in Transcaucasia. Transcaucasia, today known as the South Caucasus, is adjacent and to the east of the former Ottoman Empire. It contains the neighboring states of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Part 2 also includes a snapshot of the current situation in the Balkans, located to the west of the former Ottoman Empire. In my brief conclusion, I'll suggest a way to address collective traumatization. A forewarning. To make my argument, I'll present a lot of information. I am trusting your intuitive minds to take it in. First, my terms. I distinguish collective trauma from collective traumatization. Collective trauma is an event or events caused by human beings or by natural forces, like an earthquake. I will speak only about humanly caused, objectively observable, perceptible, concrete, physical events, such as genocide, war, ethnic cleansing, anarchy, 9/11, Manchester. Collective trauma causes collective traumatization. Collective traumatization is the intangible psychological experience of trauma, the impact of traumatic events on a people's collective mind. I'm not saying that the existence of a collective mind is any more literal than the existence of our own minds that each of us in this room and up here possesses. But the minds of each of us also, as members of groups with group identities, partakes in collective minds, the minds of our identity groups. These are groups composed of individuals of the same gender, race, religion, occupation, nationality, and many other categories. Collective traumatization is evident in a collective mind when it exhibits a mix of persistent fear, anxiety, mistrust, horror, aggression, humiliation, rage, hatred, hurt, pain, grief, depression, vengefulness. These feelings are often hidden, inchoate, unexpressed, denied, unconscious. One effect of collective traumatization in collective minds is to misperceive or distort reality. In a protracted conflict, for example, one or both parties often distorts reality when they believe that all blame lies on the other side and that it is the only victim. The distortions of reality on the one hand and the power of the difficult feelings on the other also determine that the collective mind manifests limited emotional range, limited imagination, and limited meaning-making, and the great likelihood of destructive action. When collective traumatic events continue over time, a people which is already traumatized is re-traumatized. When collective traumatization is not healed, at least to some extent, it gives rise to intergenerational or transmitted collective traumatization. Now I'm changing gears, maps. But using the terms just discussed, here's my story of destructive interconnected encounters occurring over 100 years, another 100 years war, in the larger Near East region. The Pontian Greeks figure only at the beginning of this in my story. I tell this story, however, because it illustrates dramatically how collective trauma is linked to collective traumatization and re-traumatization, in this case by repetitive mass murder and violence. The maps, as I said, will now be useful. My story begins in the 1890s with the Ottoman persecution and massacres of the Armenians, while the genocides of the Christian minorities, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians of the Ottoman Empire occurred primarily 20 years later during the First World War. Throughout this period, in adjacent Transcaucasia, ruled by the Christian Russian Empire, both Armenians and Muslims were mistreated, but not as lethally as were the Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire. From 1905 to 1907, the Russian Empire had already successfully manipulated Russian Armenians and Muslims into fighting a bitter, mindless, and extremely destructive civil war. Toward the end of the First World War, the Russian revolutions of 1917 had occurred and led to violence and anarchy in Transcaucasia. The Ottomans then invaded Transcaucasia, carrying their genocidal aims with them. This was the same historical moment, the same army, and close to the same place, northeastern Turkey, in which the notable genocidal events, not the notable, but notable genocidal events against the Pontian Greeks took place. Ottoman entry into Transcaucasia added to that region's anarchy, destruction, and enmity, especially between the Armenian and Muslim peoples. After the war, Transcaucasia was taken over by the USSR. For the next nearly 70 years, the Transcaucasian Armenians lived in the Soviet Socialist Republic of Armenia and the Transcaucasian Azeris in the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan. Each of those places contained a large minority of the other's people. Within Azerbaijan was the territory of Karabakh. Transcaucasian Armenians made up 75% of Karabakh's population. Remember, just let your intuition follow. 25% of Muslims. Over these next 7 decades, while the USSR controlled these countries, all these populations lived under the traumatic threat or often actual persecution by the USSR. Afterwards, in 1988, as the USSR was breaking up, the Karabakh parliament petitioned Moscow to separate from Soviet Azerbaijan to join Soviet Armenia against the wishes of the Azeri people. Azerbaijan reacted negatively. The Soviets refused. Karabakh had to remain part of Azerbaijan, Repressed traumatization in the form of violence had already begun erupting when the actual breakup of the USSR came. It encountered, or it created open space. Repressed traumatization to long past and recent traumatization entered that space. Repressed reaction in the form of another bitter, far more destructive war between Armenians and Azeris over Karabakh, still going on. The 1994 ceasefire finally stopped the fighting, but ever since, Azerbaijan has recurrently broken the conflict, and Armenians have responded proportionately. Today, however, the situation may be more fluid and escalatory than that. Is it volatile? Yes. This series of violent encounters spanning over 100 years is heavily revenge-driven. It has rendered and renders the people of Armenia, Karabakh, and Azerbaijan traumatized. Their traumatization contributes to disabling them from resolving their relationship. That is, both peoples seem unable to develop or use capacities of mind to figure out how to avoid repetitive destruction and make their lives productive. They are nurturing a perfect storm of more violence and traumatization. Russia has the muscle to prevent further conflict between Armenians and Azeris, but Russia acts to keep both peoples under its orbit. It arms them both. Turkey, too, could contribute to preventing further conflict. However, in 2008, Turkey and Armenia had agreed on but not signed a document called the Protocols, and I'm tying it all together to your people, to normalize their relations. But it was not signed because, on Turkey's part, Azerbaijan objected, calling on its special relationship with its Turkish brothers. If Turkey signed the protocols, it would be a slap to Azerbaijan. Why? Azerbaijan's enemy is Armenia because of the Karabakh conflict, and Turkey's enemy is also Armenia because Armenians dispute Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide. Collusion by other countries with Turkey's consistent denial of the Armenian genocide may thus lend support to continuation of these connected, long-lasting conflicts between the Azeri and Armenian peoples of the South Caucasus. Now my snapshot of today's Balkans. A month ago, in a reputable American newspaper, a well-informed policy analyst summarized the current relationship between Russia and 7 Balkan countries, excluding Greece, with regard to NATO interference in elections and control of media and social media. He concludes, and these are his words, Putin cynically pursues Russia's self-interest. To him, the Balkans represent a vulnerable underbelly of the West, ripe for meddling. Russia will likely continue its unbenign interference, including encouragement of interstate conflict right in the Balkans. Russia's weaker fraternal twin in the Near East is Turkey. If we narrow our Balkan focus to Greek-Turkish relations, Cyprus might be a good place to look. Cypriot Greeks and Turks in the island's peace movement have campaigned for years to end division and militarization of the island. Just in February, substantial progress was made on many issues long under negotiation. But then Turkey's President Erdogan stirred up division, threatened maximalist demands for security. Mistrust between the two Cypriot peoples pretty immediately reappeared. At the official level in Turkey, for as long as Erdogan keeps his grip, support for laying a basis for resolving conflicts, starting with the truth about the past, such as recognition of the Greek genocide, will take second place to keeping the official malignant Turkish narrative in place. To conclude, I offer 2 recommendations for action. The first is the important step of Parliament's recognition of the Greek genocide. If it were held to, only if, in spite of predictable pushback and threats from Erdogan, Recognition requires the truth be told publicly, however, and that is what recognition is. Such a move on the high ground, which some states in this world must take, would certainly strengthen those many Turks deeply wanting their democracy restored and remove some clout and credibility from denialism. Public acknowledgement of truth begins the process of replacement of malignant, divisive, win-lose narratives. However, much more than recognition is needed for resolution, not only to prevent repetitive violence, but to achieve stable, productive coexistence. If collective traumatization distorts perception of reality and impedes development of judgment and imaginative policies, other initiatives are needed. My second recommendation would be for the United Kingdom to develop and sponsor a new kind of process for empowerment, a joint governmental civil society initiative for the Pontic Greeks to address collectively, among themselves only, their losses and grief and the limitations of choice imposed on their collective mind by collective traumatization and collective transmitted traumatization. Empowerment cannot occur without healing. Quite a lot of healing can occur without recognition by the perpetrator. Healing is needed even with recognition. Thank you very much.
So moving to our last speaker, Dr. Nikos Michailidis is a political scientist and anthropologist. He received his PhD from the Department of Anthropology at Princeton University. His research focused on the revival of the Pontic Greek music and ethnic identity in contemporary Turkey, and was based on extensive field work and archival research conducted in Trabzon, in Istanbul, and Ankara.
So, thank you, Bobby. I'm going to talk about the potential political implications of the recognition of genocide. The right to vote is certainly critical in democracies, but it is not enough to define a regime as a democracy. A really democratic legal structure ensures basic human rights and freedoms associated with religion, ethnic identity, political expression, and peaceful assembly, among others, for each citizen. A closer look at Turkey's history makes it clear that the citizens of Turkey who were born into non-Muslim or non-Turkish families have never fully had those rights and freedoms. For decades, they have been exposed to systematic persecution and even murderous attacks. Today, only 0.2% of Turkish population is Christian or Jewish. In the absence of non-Muslim minorities, the Turkish government now targets and oppresses other Turks, mainly non-Islamist secular Turks and Gülenist Muslims, sympathizers of Islamic cleric Fethullah Gülen, a former ally of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. International media is filled with reports about the Turkish government's targeting, arresting, repressing, dismissing, and in some cases, torturing of ethnic Turks. Recent attacks against Turkish Muslim citizens of Turkey are actually standard practice by the Turkish government. The difference now is who is on the receiving end. Moreover, there is a deliberate attempt to change demographic balances in the predominantly Kurdish districts. More than 500,000 citizens from the Kurdish regions have been displaced in the last 12 months, and many thousands have been killed. Between July 2015 and December 2016, several majority Kurdish cities in southeastern Turkey were subjected to around-the-clock curfews by the Turkish government. The curfews were accompanied by military assaults against civilian populations, their homes, businesses, offices, historical monuments, reservoirs, and infrastructure, were bombed and destroyed. However, most of the ethnic Turkish citizens still fail to grasp the fact that Turkey's historical and current crimes against other populations, Greeks, Armenians, Assyrians, Jews, Alevis, Kurds, and Yazidis, as well as the silence of much of the Turkish Muslim majority, have created the ever-authoritarian, oppressive, and anti-democratic regime of Turkey. Even 95 years later, many citizens of Turkey are not well informed and still not show any sign of regret or guilt for all these incidents. And this is because of a certain political culture of denial, historical distortion, and aggression that has been cultivated by state authorities for many decades. According to common Turkish state narratives, the Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians were not victims of Turkish state persecution. Instead, the citizens of Turkey are taught that these people were mass murderers, rapists, and even plunderers, who simply sought to divide the empire. This propaganda portrays Sunni Muslim Turks as oppressed, who had every right to revolt against their oppressors, the Greeks and Armenians, who finally got what they deserved, which is extermination. In such a formula, the fact that Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrian Christians are the indigenous people of Anatolia is of little value. Official propaganda portrays Turks as the only permanent and dominant rulers of the lands they conquered since the 11th century. According to official Turkish rhetoric, the victims are perpetrators and the perpetrators are victims. The natives are invaders and the invaders are natives. The oppressed are the oppressors and the oppressors are the oppressed. Everything is turned upside down. State-sponsored history books direct their own citizens to view specific groups as their enemy. In addition, they define what they call as the Pόντου Greek problem as a major threat to national security and urge Turkish youth to be vigilant against this threat. Sadly, Turkey not only denies the Pόντου Greek and Christian genocides, it also puts the blame on the victims. The widespread propaganda about history fed to the Turkish citizens at schools, in the media and elsewhere gives many of them a false sense of supremacy and paves the way for further crimes against other groups like the Kurds and the Alevis. The distortion of historical facts regarding the genocide legitimizes an aggressive political culture and violent militarist practices in the present. This phenomenon, the strong interconnection between understandings of history and political practices in the present, has been thoroughly documented in the international bibliography by many social scientists around the world. Imagine what Germany would look like if it hadn't recognized and condemned the Holocaust. It would not be an overstatement to say that the Turkish official narrative that distorts historical facts and turns the victims into perpetrators and perpetrators into victims destroys the ability of many Turkish citizens to establish empathy with people of other ethnic or religious groups. Today, many ethnic Turks are being victimized by their own repressive government. Sadly, the Turks who oppose the Turkish government are now confronted with their own annihilation by their own Turkish brothers and sisters. Throughout the decades, it was the same atmosphere and the same hatred with public threats and violence, but it was directed at Christians, Jews, and Kurds. This was what drove many non-Muslims out of Turkey. It was not possible for non-Muslim or non-Turkish citizens of Turkey to live under constant threat and to not know where to get any justice because the government was behind the hatred and it was directing it. Now it has also turned against ethnic Turks because they are not considered Islamist enough and because they do not support the current regime. As long as the citizens of Turkey do not honestly face their history and take steps to secure justice for and show solidarity with all victims of successive Turkish governments, they seem to be bound to live under an oppressive regime which is as oppressive as former Turkish governments. In Turkey, The victims change, but the destructive nature of the regime remains the same. Mainstream Turkish political culture has been shaped by a denialist narrative of the past that rejects the genocidal violence inflicted upon the Ottoman Christian subjects. Turkish authorities spend millions of dollars to sustain and promote this official position. This denial also legitimates Turkish state aggression and political violence in the present. As long as the Turkish state fails to recognize the past and accept the mass violence it exercised against its Christian subjects, current violent practices against other vulnerable populations, such as the Kurds, the Alevis, and other minorities, will go unchallenged. For this reason, Turkey cannot become truly democratic as long as the mass violence and atrocities committed are not addressed and sincerely confronted in both Turkish state and civil society. Thus, those interested in the prospect of democracy and prosperity for all the people of this country, the respect of international law and human rights, and the peaceful coexistence and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean should join forces to push the Turkish state to recognize the genocide committed against Pontic Greeks and other Christians of Anatolia. It is really encouraging to see that a small but growing number of Turkish historians, human rights activists, and members of the civil society are participating in this humanistic struggle. There is one political party in the Turkish parliament. Its name is HDP, Halkların Demokratik Partisi, which means the People's Democratic Party, which openly has stated many times, and if you read its program, you will see that they openly recognize the genocide committed not only against the Armenians, but also against all the Christians of the empire. And they have very interesting ideas about the Cyprus issue as well. But unfortunately, what is unfortunate is that at least 2,000 members of this party, including some of the MPs and the two presidents, are currently in prison. So I will stop here and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico, for all this interesting information. So, once again, I would like to thank Lordstone for helping organizing this event, and I would like to invite him for making the concluding remarks.
Good evening. It's not a written speech, and I'm not going to keep you long, and it's not even formal. You're an amazing group. I mean, the energy here is fantastic, and the fact that we were chucked out of the House of Lords, you know, only at 11 o'clock, and for Elena and the team to be able to come here and enjoy this is fantastic. And actually, the date 1942, which is when I was born, is significant because this room was used as Parliament in 1942. When that was being bombed, Churchill had a Parliament here. And as was said earlier, in 1945, this was the first ever meeting of the UN Security Council was in this room. So it's a significant room to start something. But just coming back to 1942, I was born in 1942, I'm Jewish. That wasn't a good time to be born when you're Jewish. And we were talking about the traumatic effect of generations, and seriously, I just came up here with my case, right? I carry my case everywhere. In my case, I've got a little bag here with currencies from 17 different countries and my passport. On my word of honor, at 72, even though I'm a lord and I was the managing director of M&S, inside me, drilled into me by my parents is, if you have to go, go. Because it can happen again. Now, this is incredible. This is inside me. And I try not to tell my children that, but they know that I'm like that. And so this is passed on for 3 generations because, you know, my parents came from Russia and Eastern Europe and everything, being Jewish. So then, when I met Anthi a couple of years ago, Princess Anthi of the Pontos, and she started telling me about this genocide and that it hadn't been recognized. I didn't know enough about it, and I said that I wanted to be part of this and have something to happen. And I want something to happen because there's something else I need to tell you, which is difficult, but also in my family was abuse. I had an abusive childhood. And one of the things the family did was actually to suppress, because the person who's an abuser, that's how they get away with it. And therefore, you know, nowadays, all sorts of old cases are coming up. And now people realize you mustn't suppress those things. So whether it's, and there's Holocaust deniers all over the place. I mean, there's a fantastic film called Denial about, you know, the denial of the Jewish Holocaust. And so the perpetrators have, that's one of their clevernesses. The victims then suppress it themselves because they don't want to deny it. And therefore, if you do that, they'll get away with it and get away with it. And then there's one other thing I want to say. I'm an optimist. I love the human race. I really believe we've got a chance of saving it. And in fact, I, this year, have decided at 75 to go deeper into myself to see if I can find a more authentic me than this person who's acting in front of you, and see if I can find some more sweetness in myself, because I don't trust myself. And the reason I don't trust myself is that it's very clear to me that in humans is this potential to be able to do this thing. It happens over and over again. They're not different. These people are not different from us. It's just that something in their circumstance and their life have made them do that. So if it's in our genes, if it's in the possibility of us, then in that case we have to find a right way of making sure everybody knows it happens and happens and happens. And secondly, as was being said, we have to investigate what you do about it. And thirdly, you have to help ourselves to get over that trauma. So when Anthony and then gave me Elena, said, right, let's do something about it. And Elena has been unbelievable, and she needs a round of applause now. Right. We said, let's do something about it. And I said, look, it's very easy to have an event. People will come, we'll have some drinks and everything, and that'll be nice. And everybody, it'll be like a bar mitzvah, and then everybody goes home and says, it's great. You have to know what the purpose is. And we said the purpose is to actually now start a movement and start doing something about it. One of the things about the movement, by the way, is all this is miserable and it's awful and, you know, it's very sad, whatever, and we're all upset and angry about it. But the way to start a movement is, first of all, to celebrate something else. There is a fantastic Pontiac heritage of music, art, food, dancing, whatever. And so what we've got to do is do the two things. The next event we should have should be with some performances and something to say, look, this is what it was, and this is what it still is, and this is what it could be, and this is what was destroyed. And then anyway, you'll get a big, wider collection of people. So we want to do that. Secondly, what we want to do is give it publicity and give it airtime, and we will do that. Thirdly, because I'm a member of the House of Lords, in the House of Parliament, Lords and Commons, there are things called the all-party parliamentary groups. So there's an all-party parliamentary group on all sorts of activities, like frogs and cycling and whatever, but we can create an all-party parliamentary group on the Pontiac situation, and then get everybody who is a politician or a lord who's interested in human rights, who's interested in this region, who's interested in these traumas, to be able to say, how can we drive this through the Parliament? And we can then create some legislation in the British Parliament we can take to the UN, and also we should be doing this in other countries, so eventually there will be a collective. And by the way, in your Parliament, there should be an all-party parliamentary group on the UK, and then we can exchange things together. So, all I'm asking you to do, in that beautiful document that was quickly produced by the team, there's a little slip there to say who you are and what you do, but also to say what it is that you might be prepared to do to help us, whether it's publicity or you've got any time or you've got connections and everything. So if we've all filled that out and we start a movement here, I think it could be a very happy movement in terms of all the things, the energy you've got, but also it could be an effective movement in terms of we could get this recognized and therefore stop it happen again, and also be able to deal with your own trauma. Thank you very much.
To commemorate this event and to thank Lord Stone, we will have a commemorative placket. I would like to invite Professor Parcharidis to give this.
I thought it was going to be chocolate.
Yeah, where? Here.
Where? Oh, do you want me here? Right. This is